All right, history buffs, welcome back for part two of our deep dive.
Part two.
Yeah, part two into modern Indian history, especially for, those of you out there getting ready for the UPSC exam.
Yeah,
But listen, even if you're not, facing down the UPSC, this is really fascinating stuff.
absolutely.
For anyone who wants to understand how India's education system, became what it is today.
Right.
Last time we talked about Wood's Dispatch
Yes.
of 1854.
1854, that's right, setting the stairs.
Setting the stage, that's right.
Yeah.
So today we're tackling the Hunter Commission of 1882.
Okay.
Might sound kind of dry, at first glance, but trust me, this thing is full of juicy historical drama
It is.
and insights that could even help you on the exam.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating look at that kind of push and pull, we see under colonial rule and
Yeah.
all the debates that were raging about education back then.
Exactly. So picture this. It's late 19th century India,
Okay.
a few decades after Wood's Dispatch.
Yeah.
You've got universities, colleges,
Yeah.
schools popping up all over the place.
Yeah.
But there are these huge questions lingering.
Yeah.
Like, how is this Western-style system actually working for Indians?
Right.
What role should the government have?
Right.
What about these missionary schools?
Yeah.
And, crucially, what about education for the majority?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
rural folks,
Uh-huh.
those speaking local languages, and girls who,
Of course. Yeah.
often left out of the equation.
Often left out. That's right.
So that is where the Hunter Commission steps in.
That is where they step in.
Formed in 1882,
1882.
led by Sir William Wilson Hunter,
A Scottish civil servant.
Scottish civil servant, yes.
Yeah.
And their mission was to answer these very questions.
Absolutely. They had to kind of evaluate progress, identify hurdles,
Yeah,
and suggest ways to improve things, like a big audit.
a system audit.
Yeah, a system audit.
Now, keep in mind, this is still British Raj territory,
Right.
right? So the commission is working within that system, which to me makes their recommendations all the more intriguing.
Yes.
Some of them were surprisingly progressive,
Right.
and they had this ripple effect that I think we can still feel today.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so important for UPSC prep.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the nuance
Yeah.
of these colonial policies and what they meant in the long term.
Okay, so let's get specific.
Wow.
What were the Hunter Commission's main goals?
Well, first and foremost, I think they were really laser focused on elementary education,
Okay.
especially in rural areas, the
Yeah.
foundation.
First foundation. Yeah.
Like if you're building a house, you gotta have a strong base.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the whole thing's gonna collapse.
Right.
So they wanted to see, how that grants and aid system that was established by Wood's Dispatch
Right.
was actually functioning on the ground.
Okay.
Was the money reaching the right schools?
Right.
Were they achieving what they set out to do?
So they weren't just sitting in some ivory tower somewhere.
No, they were out there checking,
They were in the field.
was the policy matching the reality?
I like that.
Yeah,
They were in the field.
they were in the field.
Okay, so they were, doing that, and they were also looking into the role of the missionary schools.
They were a big part of the landscape then,
Huge. Yeah.
figuring out their impact and how they fit into the system.
Yeah. And this is where things get really interesting to me.
Okay.
They went beyond their initial focus on just primary education
Right.
and ended up looking at secondary and higher education too.
Yeah, because they realized you can't isolate one level of education. It's
Right.
all interconnected.
Yeah.
It's like trying to understand the circulatory system by just looking at the heart.
Right.
You got to see the whole picture.
You need the whole picture.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's get to those famous recommendations.
Okay.
Like what were some of the big ones?
Well, there were a lot, but let's highlight the ones that are most relevant for UPSC aspirants.
Okay.
So one major push was to expand and improve elementary education,
Okay.
particularly in rural areas,
Right.
That solid foundation is crucial.
Yeah, it's interesting how often these historical parallels come up.
Yeah.
It's like, don't neglect the basics.
Don't neglect the basics. Exactly.
Yeah.
And they went even further. They advocated for primary education to be delivered in the local language.
Wow.
A huge departure from the emphasis on English.
Huge, yeah.
They understood that if you want education to truly reach people, it needs to be in a language they understand best.
That's a big deal.
It is.
So they were acknowledging the importance of vernacular languages,
Right.
even under British rule.
Even under British rule.
Did that cause any controversy?
It did. We'll dive into that a bit later.
Okay.
But for now, let's move on to another key recommendation.
Okay.
Shifting the management of primary education
Okay.
to local bodies. like district and municipal boards.
Ah, so decentralization.
Decentralization of education.
Right.
A big deal. They believed local bodies would be more in tune with their community's needs.
Right.
And could manage the schools better.
So we've got an emphasis on elementary education.
Uh-huh.
We've got using vernacular languages, decentralization. What else?
Well, they also zeroed in on that lack of opportunities for girls and women,
Right.
particularly that stark difference between urban and rural areas,
Yes.
where girls often didn't even have access to basic education.
Sadly, a common theme back then.
And theme, yeah.
But the fact that they explicitly addressed it is significant.
It is.
So what do they propose?
Well, several things. They encouraged more girls' schools,
Okay.
especially in rural areas, and they stressed the need for female teachers,
Right.
recognizing that would make education more accessible
Yeah.
and acceptable to families who might be hesitant to send their daughters to a school staffed by men.
That's smart, addressing those cultural sensitivities while still pushing for progress.
Absolutely.
They seem very pragmatic, like working within the system, but advocating for change.
You're absolutely right. They weren't out to dismantle the system. They wanted to make it work better
Yeah.
for Indians.
And speaking of pragmatic, they also recommended prioritizing literate candidates for those lower-level government jobs.
It was a clever way to incentivize literacy.
It was.
Connecting education to tangible benefits.
Yeah,
Made it more appealing.
totally. Okay, so we've covered a lot here.
Oh.
Did they have anything to say about private schools?
They did. They encouraged their growth,
Yeah.
but with a condition government funding should come with government regulation.
Okay, so a partnership
Partnership.
between public and private sector.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay. Any specific recommendations for secondary education?
One that stands out is separating academic and vocational tracks at the secondary level.
Okay.
They recognized not everyone was headed for higher education
Right.
and wanted to offer alternative paths.
So more diverse system.
A more diverse system catering to different aspirations.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, they wanted to better prepare students for the workforce
Okay.
and to contribute to India's economic development.
Makes sense.
Not everyone needs to be a scholar, but everyone needs a way to contribute
Right.
and earn a living.
Okay, great. But did the British government actually listen?
Oh, they did.
Did they implement any of these recommendations?
They did. In fact, many of the recommendations were adopted,
Well-
leading to significant changes, especially in how primary education was run.
That's reassuring.
Yeah, it wasn't just a report gathering dust on a shelf.
Right.
This spurred real change.
So their work had practical consequences.
It did.
What were some of the most noticeable outcomes?
One striking change was a decreased focus on British subjects at the primary level.
Oh, wow.
Remember that push for education in the local language?
Right.
Well, that started taking root.
So a shift away from Anglicization,
To some extent, of course, English remained important,
especially for higher ed.
especially for higher education.
Right.
But there was this growing recognition of the value of vernacular languages.
Now, this is all relevant for UPSC, right?
Absolutely.
Understanding these shifts and the debates
Yeah,
about language and education during colonial India is crucial.
it is.
And speaking of seeing the big picture,
Okay.
there's another major development to consider.
Uh-huh.
The establishment of Punjab University
Yes.
in 1882.
In 1882.
Okay.
How does that tie in?
Well, the Hunter Commission had pointed out this huge strain on Calcutta University,
Right.
which was basically responsible for this massive area.
Right.
Punjab University helped ease that burden
Okay.
and pointed toward more regionalized higher education.
Interesting. So the Hunter Commission's recommendations had like a ripple effect
They did.
across the entire education system,
Across the whole system.
from primary schools to universities.
Absolutely.
And one final thing to note, literacy rates went up
They did.
between 1882 and 1901.
That's right. Now, it's hard to say it was all due to the commission,
Right.
but it suggests their efforts were having some impact.
Some impact, yeah.
This has been incredibly insightful.
It has.
But before we move on, there's one more thing I want to touch on.
Yeah.
How did this emphasis on vernacular education affect the development of regional languages and identities in India?
Oh, excellent question. That's something we'll explore in detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But for now,
A little cliffhanger.
a little cliffhanger.
Why don't you ponder that?
Okay. I like it if you're enjoying this deep dive into modern Indian history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button
Yes.
and give us a like. It helps others discover the show.
It does.
We'll be back soon with more on this fascinating world of the Hunter Commission and its legacy. Until then, keep those history books open and don't let the curiosity fade.
Keep that curiosity flowing.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See you soon. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Hunter Commission.
It's amazing how a commission formed under British rule could spark such fundamental changes, in India's education system.
It really is. And last time we left our listeners with a pretty thought-provoking question. How did the Hunter Commission's focus on vernacular education impact regional languages and identities?
Right.
It feels like we're stepping into the realm of unintended consequences here.
Precisely, while the British probably saw vernacular education as like a practical way to make basic education more accessible,
Right.
they may not have fully grasped the potential cultural and political ramifications.
Okay, let's unpack that the Commission recommended teaching primary education in local languages, which makes sense. It's easier for kids to learn in their mother tongue.
Yeah.
But what were the ripple effects?
Well, think about it. Before this, English was heavily emphasized, especially in higher education,
Yeah.
and it created a kind of elite class.
Yeah.
Fluency in English opened doors to government jobs, higher education, a whole different world.
So English was like a gatekeeper in a way.
Exactly, but by promoting vernacular education, the Hunter Commission unintentionally opened a door for wider participation.
Mhm.
In education and public life, more people could get educated even if they weren't fluent in English.
That makes sense. But how did this impact regional languages specifically?
Think about the demand it generated. Suddenly there's a need for more textbooks, literature newspapers, all in these local languages.
Right.
It's almost like a literary boom was ignited.
Wow, that's quite an image. A literary boom fueled by the need for educational materials in local languages.
And this, in turn, fueled a sense of regional pride and identity. People were reading, writing, and debating in their own languages,
Yeah.
connecting with their heritage on a deeper level.
It's almost as if the British, by trying to make education more efficient, accidentally sowed the seeds for stronger regional identities.
Right.
Talk about irony.
History is full of these ironic twists and turns, and this is exactly why the Hunter Commission is such an important topic for UPSC aspirants. It highlights those complex relationships, between education, language, identity, even the rise of nationalism.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion, and there's always more to discover.
Absolutely.
But before we get too carried away, let's bring it back to our listeners prepping for the UPSC exam. What are the key takeaways they should remember about the Hunter Commission?
Excellent point. Here are a few must-knows.
Okay.
First, they should be able to explain the context. Why was the commission formed?
Okay.
What were its objectives?
Yeah.
Who were the key players? Context is key for understanding any historical event.
Okay, context is crucial. What else?
Second, and this is super important, they should be able to discuss the major recommendations of the Hunter Commission.
Okay.
We've covered quite a few. The emphasis on primary education, the push for vernacular languages, the decentralization of management, the focus on female education, the promotion of private schools.
Right, those are the big ones. And for each recommendation, it's not enough to just list them. They need to explain the reasoning behind them and their potential impact.
Absolutely. It's all about showing a deeper understanding of the why behind those suggestions and the consequences they had.
So context recommendations, rationale, and impact. What else should they keep in mind?
Lastly, they need to connect the Hunter Commission to those broader themes in modern Indian history.
Okay.
We've touched on some, the growth of nationalism, the role of language and education in shaping identity, the tensions between centralization and decentralization,
All right.
and that evolving relationship between the British government and Indian society.
It's all connected. The Hunter Commission wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a much larger story.
Exactly. For UPSC, showing that you can see the big picture and understand how these different events and ideas are intertwined is crucial.
To all our dedicated UPSC aspirants out there, don't just memorize facts, think critically, analyze, make connections. That's how you'll ace that exam.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Now let's dive into a specific example that illustrates the impact of the Hunter Commission's focus on vernacular education.
I love a good example. What have you got for us?
Let's look at Bengal in the late 19th century.
Okay.
Following the Hunter Commission's recommendations, there was this surge in the publication of Bengali textbooks, literature, and newspapers.
It's like the Commission's report was a catalyst.
Exactly. This surge led to a kind of literary renaissance with writers like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and Bendranath Tagore
Yeah.
producing some of their most famous works in Bengali.
Those are names everyone should recognize, but what's the connection to the Hunter Commission?
These writers and many others were able to reach a much wider audience because they were writing in the language that people understood and connected with.
So instead of just catering to the English-speaking elite,
Yeah.
they were engaging with a much broader swath of Bengali society.
Precisely. And this had a huge impact on the development of Bengali literature culture and even a sense of Bengali identity.
It's like a chain reaction. The Hunter Commission promotes vernacular education, leading to a flourishing of Bengali literature, which strengthens Bengali identity and culture.
Exactly. And we see this pattern replicated in other regions as well. The Hunter Commission's emphasis on vernacular education, however unintentional, helped foster the development of regional languages and identities across India.
It's a powerful reminder that even seemingly small policy decisions can have far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences.
Indeed, and that's the beauty of history. It's filled with these unintended consequences and interconnected events that have shaped the world we live in today.
Okay, so we've explored the Hunter Commission's recommendations, the impact on regional languages and identities, and even highlighted a specific example from Bengal. I'd say we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, but there's still more to uncover in the final part of our deep dive. We'll examine some of the criticisms and limitations of the Hunter Commission and explore its lasting legacy on the Indian education system.
Can't wait to delve into that. We'll see you soon for the grand finale of our Hunter Commission deep dive. Welcome back, listeners, for the final part of our Hunter Commission journey.
The final...
We've explored its origins, its main recommendations, and how it kind of influenced everything.
Yeah.
From, regional languages to the rise of nationalism.
Big stuff.
But, as with any historical event,
Yeah.
there's always more to the story.
Right. No historical event exists in a vacuum.
Right.
And while the Hunter Commission led to some, big changes,
Yeah.
it's important to acknowledge its limitations and the criticisms that it faced.
Okay, let's get into that.
Yeah.
What were some of the main criticisms leveled at the Hunter Commission?
Well, one common critique, especially from Indian nationalists at the time,
Yeah.
was that the commission didn't go far enough in promoting Indian control over education.
Right.
Remember, this was still the British Raj.
Of course.
And education was seen as a tool for, maintaining their control.
So even though the commission advocated for some decentralization, like giving local bodies more management power,
Right.
it didn't really challenge the overall power structure.
Exactly. Critics argued that real educational reform meant giving Indians more autonomy,
Yeah.
more decision-making power over their own education system.
Makes sense? Were there other criticisms?
Another point of contention was that continued emphasis on English,
Okay.
especially at the higher levels of education.
Right.
While the commission promoted vernacular languages at the primary level,
Uh-huh.
they also acknowledged the importance of English
Right.
for higher education and government jobs.
So it's kind of a mixed message.
A little bit, yeah.
Promoting local languages, but still upholding English dominance.
Yes, and this was seen by some as perpetuating a system that favored the privileged,
Right.
those already fluent in English.
It's like creating a two-tiered system, vernacular education for the masses,
Right.
and English education for the elite,
Exactly.
which would only widen the gap between the haves and have-nots.
That's the argument critics made.
Yeah.
And there was another critique regarding the commission's focus on practical and vocational training. While they recognized the need for skilled workers, some argued that emphasizing vocational education might limit opportunities for higher education and social mobility.
So like a concern that vocational training might become a track leading away from higher education and leadership roles,
Precisely.
rather than towards them.
Yeah, this tied back to that bigger debate about the purpose of education.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Was it about creating a skilled workforce to serve the colonial administration?
Right.
Or was it about empowering individuals, fostering critical thinking,
Right.
a sense of citizenship?
That's a fundamental question that I think we're still grappling with today.
We are.
What is the true purpose of education?
It really is. And the Hunter Commission, operating within the context of British rule,
Right.
couldn't fully escape those tensions
Right.
and competing priorities.
Okay, so we've explored some limitations, some criticisms, but before we wrap up, I want to touch on the legacy of the Hunter Commission. How did its recommendations shape the Indian education system in the long term?
That's a great question. Despite its limitations, the Hunter Commission did have a lasting impact.
Okay.
Its emphasis on primary education, especially in vernacular languages, helped expand access to education for a much larger segment of the population.
So even though it didn't dismantle the colonial power structure,
Right.
it did create some positive change on the ground.
It did. And while English remained dominant, the promotion of vernacular languages
Yeah.
contributed to the growth of regional literature and a sense of cultural identity.
Right. We talked about that in the previous episode, those unintended consequences
Exactly.
of promoting regional languages.
And the Commission's recommendations regarding the management of education, with an increased role for local bodies, set the stage for future decentralization efforts.
So they planted seeds that might not have fully blossomed until much later.
Precisely. And even the criticism about the focus on vocational training,
Yeah.
well, that focus did contribute to the development of technical and industrial education in India.
So a mixed bag, but with some lasting positive contributions.
That's a fair assessment. The Hunter Commission was a product of its time,
Right.
working within the confines of British rule.
Of course.
But it also paved the way for future reforms and helped shape the future of education in India.
Well said. And for our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exam,
Yeah.
the key takeaway here is to approach these historical events with nuance and critical thinking.
Yes.
It's not about black and white. It's about understanding the complexities,
Right.
the different perspectives,
Right.
the long-term impacts.
Absolutely. The Hunter Commission perfectly illustrates this.
Yes.
It was a moment of both continuity and change.
Yes.
Reflecting those tensions and possibilities of education in colonial India.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Hunter Commission. We've explored its origins, recommendations, impact criticisms, and lasting legacy. I hope you found this journey as insightful and informative as we did.
Me too.
And remember, the real learning continues when you keep exploring and asking questions.
It does.
So keep those history books open, those neurons firing,
Keep them firing.
and keep diving deep into this fascinating world of modern Indian history.
Fascinating stuff.
And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a comment. Let us know what other historical deep dives you'd like us to take on.
Yeah. What do you want to hear about?
Until next time, happy learning.
Happy learning.